Chapter 27, Dictatorships and the Second World War. Part 1, The Rise of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Systems of government with one person in charge are nothing new in European history. Typically, it took on the form of conservative and authoritarianism, like we saw with Catherine the Great in Russia or Clemens von Metternich in Austria. But in the aftermath of World War I, you saw more radical political parties emerge. These would be left-wing communist parties and right-wing fascist parties that began in all major European nations. These parties are going to come to control the countries of the Soviet Union, Germany, and Italy. Now, these take on the characteristics of totalitarianism, and this is radically different than the conservative authoritarianism that we've been discussing in the early 19th and late 18th centuries. These were one-party political systems that sought to exert total control over its citizens. Typically, you saw a charismatic leader. You saw censorship and propaganda campaigns that were attempting to completely remake its citizenry. Traditionally, communists and fascists are seen as polar opposites on the political spectrum, but some have made the argument that these similarities that I just discussed mean that they're actually more closely related, and this is sometimes called horseshoe theory. I first heard this in high school, and I must admit this was my reaction.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
That might be harsh, because there are indeed similarities between communism as practiced under Joseph Stalin and fascism as practiced under Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini.
Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
No, my first instinct was correct, because communism and fascism do have radical differences. One of the main differences is that communism was an international philosophy, whereas fascism stressed nationalism. Another major difference was over the question of race. The Nazis in particular, but fascism in general, preached the superiority of their own people. The Nazis popularized the science, pseudoscience actually, of eugenics, which is what leads to the Holocaust. But we'll discuss the Holocaust in more detail later. First, the focus needs to be on Russia. Last we talked, Lenin had led a successful communist revolution in 1917. In the aftermath, a civil war begins immediately, which would be fought from 1918 to 1921. During the Civil War, Russia was following a policy known as war communism, where all economic activity was controlled by the government. In 1921, Lenin switches to the new economic policy, which allowed some free enterprise and peasants to own some land and farm it for themselves. This leads to a period of economic recovery. Lenin suffers a stroke in 1922 and passes away in 1924 without naming a successor.
Must crush capitalism.
And since zombie Lenin wasn't a practical choice to lead this new country, that meant that someone had to fill the power vacuum. The two main candidates were Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Trotsky seemed like the obvious candidate. He had led the Red Army during the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, but he was in favor of a policy known as permanent revolution, which said that for the Soviet Union to succeed, it had to spread communism beyond its borders. Joseph Stalin, on the other hand, favored a policy known as socialism in one country. This policy stated that the vast multi-ethnic empire that was Russia, which would be renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was capable of committing the communist revolution on its own, and that socialism needed to be strengthened in the Soviet Union first. Through political maneuvering, Joseph Stalin is able to emerge as the dominant leader of the Soviet Union by 1928. In 1928, Stalin is going to begin the first five-year plan. This is going to press for rapid industrial development. To make that happen, Stalin ordered for the collectivization of agriculture, so this meant the end of the new economic policy. Peasants who had been allowed to own their own land and sell their surpluses were now forced off of their family plots into massive collective farms. The biggest disaster is going to occur in Ukraine, where a man-made famine is going to result in the deaths of millions of people. It is a cruel but real victory for Joseph Stalin, as 93% of peasant households are put onto these collective farms. The rapid industrialization is equally and actually more successful, as industrial output is increased by a factor of 4 from 1928 to 1937. Because the focus was on heavy machinery, this had a few different results. One, you saw a massive increase in the urban population of Russia as peasants moved from the countryside to these cities. It also meant that there was a lack of consumer goods, as the focus was on producing steel and the other necessary materials in a modern industrial state. One of the biggest shortages, though, would be in housing, and that would be a sin in the Soviet Union, and actually it'd be an issue throughout most of Soviet history. However, many Soviets did experience a number of benefits from the reign of Stalin. The rapid industrialization offered the possibility for advancement that had not existed for many peasants prior to the Russian Revolution. Education was opened up to the vast majority of citizens, including women, who entered the medical field in large numbers. But culture, in all of its areas, was thoroughly politicized, with intellectuals ordered to try to engineer the human mind to exalt the lives of ordinary workers and glorify the Russian Revolution. When Stalin's number 2 man, Sergei Kirov, was mysteriously killed in 1934, Stalin blamed it on fascist agents within the Communist Party, and he used the incident to purge the party of supposed traitors and solidify his own control. The resulting state-sponsored repression resulted in the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938. These were a series of public show trials, which oftentimes false evidence was used to try to incriminate party administrators and Red Army leaders. Stalin had over 6 million people arrested and put on trial during this time period. About 1 to 2 million were either executed or sent to work camps in which they never returned home from. But Stalin wasn't satisfied with just making people physically be removed. He actually went so far as to have people removed from images, like this image of Leon Trotsky, who was a major problem for Joseph Stalin because Leon Trotsky had been a major part of the Russian Revolution. And so now he is removed from the official party documents, which allows Joseph Stalin to minimize Trotsky's role in the Russian Revolution and emphasize his own. These would have tremendous cost on the Soviet Union as it weakened its economic, intellectual, and military strength with this loss of life and loss of leaders. But despite these costs, they have a real practical benefit, as about 1.5 million party members are added to the Communist Party who are extremely loyal to Joseph Stalin. We will continue talking about the rise of other dictatorships later.